Judges, would you please introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Steinhoff. I am joining today from Casper, Wyoming. I am the Executive Director of the John P. L. Bogan Foundation, which does grant-making work in Wyoming, including an emphasis on civics education initiatives like this one. And I am delighted to hear from you this afternoon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Barnhart. I am an attorney in Indianapolis, Indiana. I serve as the Chief Counsel and the Director of the Consumer Protection Division of the Indiana Attorney General's Office. I'm a We the People alum, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
I'm Marcia Holland. I'm an attorney in Missoula, Montana. Most of my legal career, however, was up in Alaska as a public defender. Since moving back to Montana, I teach now at the law school, and I just finished my 9th Zoom mock trial. So I'm looking forward to seeing you and this congressional hearing on Zoom. I'm excited that the center was able to make sure this competition happened this year. So looking forward to it.
All right, and students, if you will please introduce yourselves as well as any teachers, mentors, or coaches that assisted you.
Good afternoon. We're Unit 6 from Maine South High School. Our esteemed coaches are Andrew Trankel and Kevin C. Hansen. My name is Tommy Weber.
And I'm Matthew Marigill.
I'm Morgan Fanning. And I'm Maggie Ryan. Thank you for having us today.
Well, thank you. Without further ado, we'll get started. This is Unit 6. We will hear from you today. Question number 2. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree? Why? What disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence?" You may begin when you're ready.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom." Today, America remains the most prominent military power in the world, backed by the largest defense industry and the largest military budget, which has allowed for unwarranted influence and the disastrous rise of misplaced power.
In order to prioritize American citizens and limit the military expenses founders were wary of, we suggest a decrease in unnecessary military engagements abroad and an increase in foreign civilized policing where the U.S. presence is needed, namely lowering our military costs and allowing for additional spending on healthcare and education programs.
Eisenhower rightly expressed fears of the military-industrial complex, defined as a country's military establishment, along with the defense industry, who supplies the military's weaponry. These fears stemmed from the issues of growing tension overseas, private weapon manufacturing companies acquiring immense power due to increasing amounts of worldwide weapon demand, and disagreements among Americans of how strong and well-funded our own military must be.
The fears of misplaced power within the system that exists today. According to the Pentagon budget, citizens' tax dollars are not being spent to aid our troops and veterans, but rather are being directed to arms corporations and what we deem to be unnecessary militarization.
Many politicians justify this spending by declaring that this industry creates jobs. However, a 2011 study by economists from the University of Massachusetts showed that military spending is the worst way to create jobs. Putting the same money into any other area, from infrastructure to alternative energy to healthcare or education, creates up to twice as many jobs.
The United States must focus their spending on domestic issues that face Americans, like climate change, instead of spending outrageous amounts of money on foreign adventures. Eisenhower summed up best by his claim: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in a final sense, a theft from those who hunger are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone."
The framers feared the concept of a standing army as an expensive anti-democratic tool of oppression. During the Constitutional Convention, Madison said, "The means of defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home. A large army," the founders recognized, "would also place a financial burden on the new republic. Funds for the military would divert resources from more beneficial government programs."
In the end, the framers developed a standing army, but in Adams's words, it was to be, quote, "watched with a jealous eye." Congress was given the power in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12 to raise and support armies, with the caveat that no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Amendments in the Bill of Rights, furthermore, like 2, 3, and 4, all place limitations on military power in order to defend the people.
We believe that America must take a more restrained role in world affairs. As Naval Affairs Specialist Ronald O'Rourke writes in a report to Congress, observers in favor of a more restrained role believe it is helpful in reestablishing respect for national sovereignty as a guide point for U.S. foreign policy and for organizing international affairs, and encouraging U.S. allies and security partners in Eurasia to do more to defend themselves.
Our foreign policy must be based around what we as Americans find most important. The world values the U.S. for its belief in human rights, which is why it is our job to ensure that regimes like the Chinese and Russians do not gain a foothold that would endanger our world order.
In conclusion, similar to the framers' approach, the United States must resist unnecessary intervention abroad and limit the powers of the military-industrial complex as Eisenhower warned against. However, we also believe the U.S. has an obligation to enforce foreign civilized policing in vulnerable countries where the U.S. presence is needed. By decreasing foreign military aid, America can use excess funds to focus on internal issues affecting Americans, such as healthcare and education. Thank you. We're now open for questions.
All right, thank you very much. I'm curious to hear your take on what impact would physical or financial retraction of the military have on the US's reputation throughout the world?
Well, I think it's important to note that the U.S. spends the largest, by far the largest on its military of any other nation. And we're not advocating for the complete eradication of how much the U.S. spends on its military. We are also seen as, we're also the leader of military technology around the world, and we are also the supplier of many of our allies, and we supply weapons to many other countries. So I think that the United States needs to focus more on defending itself and removing money from increasing the size of its military and just defending itself and not aiding other nations as much.
Yeah, our obligation as the U.S., considering that we are the most powerful country in the world, is definitely to maintain a presence. However, as we state in our speech, we believe we should be limiting foreign adventures and also limiting the military-industrial complex. As Eisenhower was warning against in his particular quote, for example, in 2017, the largest defense contractor, Lockheed Martin, sold about $44.9 billion worth of weapons to foreign countries, which is obviously an insane amount of money. However, this exactly, as Eisenhower warned against, is something that we need to limit as a country to be able to limit our military spending and further bring that money to other programs in need.
As we see, our presence in the Middle East has only caused more issues than actually helping what's happening in the Middle East. Like we see in a study done by the CSIFO Economic Studies, they found that U.S. drone strikes in Afghanistan and Pakistan actually increased once a drone strike was conducted in those areas. Terrorist attacks increased in those areas after that. And also U.S. drone strikes have killed about 2,000 civilians since we began doing those in the Middle East. So I'd say that our presence around the world is more of a hindrance sometimes than actually helping the people that live in those countries.
Sorry, let me ask you this. What a war looks like changes about every generation. And so if the next iteration of war really doesn't involve boots on the ground, but it's cyber attacks in elections, it's interfering with some kind of financial decision-making, would that be considered an act of war? And would our current military population be able to deal with those kinds of acts of aggression?
Yeah, so that is definitely a new type of war that we have seen. We've seen it in the 2016 election, and some may argue in the 2020 election. And so I think that we must, the national security team has addressed that as an issue and are working to develop a team and have developed a team to address attacks that of cyber warfare.
Yeah, I think with the topic of the budget during these wars, they've changed over the years. And I think it's important to address the US budget needs to be reiterated and rethought as we're not in a war. However, with your point about cyber wars and the new state of wars, we need to readdress. For example, Eisenhower, after the Korean War, dropped the military budget 27% and didn't even take that money away from the military in particular. He just took that money and put it into testing, reevaluation, knowledge-based media platforms to try to prepare the US for future wars and the changing effects of war.
I think it's also important to note how ill-equipped the U.S. is. at its current state to defend against cyber wars, as the whole reason that the United States spends money on creating new fighters and new tanks is the fact that the Chinese have consistently been able to hack the United States and steal its technology for its current weapon systems.
Thank you.
You've noted a few times the influence that lobbying has on this particular topic. Do you think that there should be a limit on the sphere of those lobbyists, or some other regulation of that influence and power that they bring to this conversation?
Oh, I believe there for sure needs to be some kind of way to stop this kind of influence. Like we even see with our newest Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. He's a retired general, and he used to be a chairman on the board of Raytheon. And so recently saw that he earned $1.7 million from his last job working for Raytheon. And we saw recently when he went to India, where they were brokering a deal for missiles, the Indian government was thinking about getting missiles from the Russians. But then Lloyd Austin said they might put reparations on India, not reparations, they put sanctions on India if they would not buy from America. But who makes the American missiles? Raytheon. So in the way that we see so much influence of what actually happens with our militaries, that we need to put a clear, concise way to keep those companies out of our government.
Yeah, adding off of that, I think what kind of we're discussing is known as the revolving door, and you see various problems with retired Congress members or Pentagon staff members going to work for defense corporations following their resignation. And so and you see also Lockheed Martin, one of the biggest defense corporations in the US, donating trillions of dollars to campaigns specifically within these defense contractors that contract their defense contracts. And so I think that we definitely need to place limitations on the unwarranted influence that Eisenhower warned against within the system, not just abroad and internationally with weapon demand.
We also see this in the nations that the United States sells weapons to, as the U.S. government needs to approve the sale of weapons to any other nation from a private company. And the United States has sold fighter jets to India and Pakistan, two nations who historically do not get along, and has a history of conflict and fighting wars throughout the 20th century.
Additionally, out of the 100 largest defense contractors, America comprises 57% of those total arms sales, which I think proves the point of your question, that we do need to limit the power of these companies because of the power that they have attained.
Thank you.
Should we tact and sort of move the military's focus internationally to a more domestic focus? Do you think we should use those resources at home, not necessarily contracting, but having the military kind of address needs or concerns within its borders?
Yeah, so I think that a major war that we are facing as Americans, and actually globally as well, is climate change. It's a war against our fight for habitants. And so I think that it's important that we pull out of the Middle East, as Biden has already done in recent times and previously, and use those funds to really convert to clean energy so that our children and our great-grandchildren, grandchildren have a place to inhabit in America. For if temperatures continue to rise, regions like Australia, North Africa, and the Western United States will be unsafe to inhabit.
Our military has also been instrumental in our vaccine rollout. As we see today, the United States is one of the leaders in amount of population that's vaccinated, and the U.S. Army has done an extraordinary job at setting up vaccination sites and vaccinating many people throughout the country.
So I'm thinking I won't get an answer because of time, but if there was suddenly war declared, say, against North Korea, would each of you agree to go serve in the Army, and assuming that women would be drafted as well as men?
I would,
That's a very interesting question.
Yes. I wish we had more time, obviously.
Yes, well, thank you. I am looking at my notes here, but I think you just did an exceptional job. We know that this question is a difficult one and that it's different than some of the others we see in Unit 6, but you brought this passion and knowledge to a question that we weren't sure where that would exist. So thank you. You did a really wonderful job. You hooked me immediately with your prepared remarks with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., which I was certainly not expecting. And so I think you just continued to put information through there that talked about the different dynamics of this, but also just really kind of helped clearly define and create some coherence between where you started with that quote and defining the military industrial complex and who's a part of that and what the implications are. So you thoroughly answered each of the questions in a way that was easy to identify your responses, and appreciated that. And then you just carried that coherence on into the question and answer session. You have very rich knowledge, an absolute depth and breadth of knowledge on this issue, each one of you. So really incredible participation. Very well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say I particularly appreciated your opening statement. It provided a really good roadmap of where you were headed and kind of what you wanted to say in your positions. That's helpful for us as judges, so we can ask you really thoughtful questions and kind of dig into it a little bit more. So thank you for doing that. And in your answers as well, and your follow-up, I think you provided really interesting examples and gave us a lot to think about. So well done. Nice job.
And I'm just looking at my notes. One of the things that is really impressive is that you anticipated that the argument that the military, especially defense contracts, creates jobs, and you knocked that one down. I mean, you did the research to point out that that is really not a legitimate reason. And to me, that demonstrates that you really understand this question. You really thought about it, what it means in real life in terms of job growth. And just switching from that to talk about Madison and the financial burden that it would be to a young nation versus where the military is now, that contrast, just that mental contrast was really profound, I think. And I also like that you just pointed out, you're only supposed to get refinanced for 2 years. And when has that ever really stopped anyone? So the level of detail that you did your research in was really impressive. Great job. And finally, I wish we would have had more time because each of you had such interesting things to say and you worked so well as a team that I think we only got through about 4 questions when I think we could have spent another half an hour to 2 days talking with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Job.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.